Sometimes the most haunting part of a crime isn't the act itself, but the silence that follows. In the case of State of Utah versus Tyler James Robinson, that silence was deafening. For weeks, Robinson sat in custody, accused of a crime that shook the country, the shocking killing of Charlie Kirk. The evidence was strong, the charges were heavy, but one question lingered in every courtroom, every newsroom, and every grieving home. Why? Why did Tyler Robinson commit this act? Was it anger, ideology, or something more hidden, something larger than himself? For months, there were no answers. Robinson refused to speak, refused to explain, leaving investigators, families, and communities trapped in the shadows of his silence. But recently, that silence cracked. In a confession no one saw coming, Robinson finally spoke. He claimed he wasn't acting alone, that someone influenced him, that he was sent, that his decision was not entirely his own. If that confession is true, then Charlie Kirk's death was never just the act of one man. It was part of something bigger, something hidden, something that may still be unfolding. Tonight, we examine Robinson's confession, the evidence surrounding it, and the chilling possibility that the truth is far more complicated than we ever expected. But before we dive in, make sure you hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our deep dives into the world of true crime. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from and whether you believe Robinson's confession reveals the truth or just another attempt to shift the blame. This is the story of Tyler Robinson's silence, his confession, and the haunting question that remains: who sent him, and why did he kill Charlie Kirk? To understand this case, we have to step back, before the courtroom, before the confession, before the silence that followed. Charlie Kirk was more than just a name in the headlines. He was a son, a friend, a man with ambitions, and someone whose presence carried weight in his community. He spent his time speaking at events, sharing his views, and building a following that admired his conviction, even when others disagreed with his stance. For those close to him, Charlie was remembered not for controversy, but for the small details: his laugh, his drive, his loyalty to the people around him. When his life was cut short, it wasn't just an attack on one man. It was a wound that rippled through families, communities, and across the nation. His death was not only tragic, it was public, unfolding before countless eyes, cementing itself in the collective memory of a country already on edge. And then there was Tyler James Robinson. To those who knew him growing up, Robinson was not a figure of public importance. He was described as quiet, sometimes withdrawn, and at times unpredictable. Like many young men, he carried frustrations, insecurities, and a search for identity. But beneath the surface, there were signs, conversations online, private messages, and fragments of thought that suggested he was drifting toward darker influences. The intersection of these two men, one standing at the center of a stage, the other standing in the shadows, would become the foundation of a tragedy no one could ignore. On the surface, the act appeared straightforward. Robinson targeted Charlie Kirk, carried out the killing, and was quickly taken into custody. But from the beginning, investigators and the public sensed there was more beneath the surface. Why Kirk? Why then? And most of all, why Robinson? As the world would soon learn, the answers to those questions were anything but simple. And on that day, when silence turned into violence, the world was left to piece together how a man like Robinson could carry out such an act, and why his victim had to be Charlie Kirk. It was meant to be another ordinary event. Charlie Kirk had taken the stage, his words carrying across the room as he addressed the crowd gathered to hear him speak. Supporters filled the seats, cameras recorded every moment, and security monitored the setting as they had done countless times before. But somewhere in that crowd was Tyler Robinson. In the days leading up to the event, investigators would later discover Robinson had been preparing. Messages traced to his accounts revealed discussions of timing, clothing, and even worries about what might happen if authorities searched his home. He had hidden clothes, stashed a rifle, and left behind a digital trail that hinted at something far more deliberate than a sudden impulse. And then, the moment came. As Kirk continued his speech, Robinson moved. What happened next was swift, brutal, and unforgettable. A shot rang out. Panic spread through the room. People ducked for cover, screams filled the air, and within seconds the event was transformed from a gathering of ideas into a scene of horror. Charlie Kirk collapsed, chaos took hold, attendees scrambled for safety, security rushed the stage, and within moments the nightmare had claimed its victim. Charlie Kirk was gone, his life cut short in front of an audience who would never forget the sound, the shock, and the silence that followed. Robinson didn't escape the scene. In fact, it wasn't long before images of him circulated through the media, his face recognized by those closest to him. It was his own family who confirmed what the nation had begun to suspect, that Tyler Robinson was the man behind the attack. Within just over a day, Robinson was in custody. The weapon had been linked to him. The planning, the preparation, the chilling signs, they were already beginning to emerge. But even as law enforcement built their case, even as the evidence began to stack higher and higher, one question grew heavier, more urgent, and more haunting than the rest. Why? The crime had been carried out, the evidence was falling into place. But the motive, the reason behind it all, remained locked away, hidden behind Robinson's silence. In the hours and days after Charlie Kirk's death, investigators worked relentlessly to reconstruct the truth. Tyler Robinson was already in custody, but the question was not only who had pulled the trigger, it was why. The first threads came from the weapon itself. Forensic testing revealed DNA traces tying the rifle directly back to Robinson. Ballistics confirmed it was the same weapon used on that stage. The physical evidence alone painted a clear picture. This was no accident. It was targeted, it was deliberate, but physical evidence was only the beginning. Investigators dug deeper, following Robinson's digital footprints. They uncovered a series of Discord messages, late-night conversations where Robinson had spoken about plans that hinted at violence. He had written about timing, preparation, and even fear that authorities might discover what he was hiding before he could act. Text messages to his roommate revealed even more worries about stashing clothing, concern over the rifle, and the possibility of being caught. These weren't the words of a man who stumbled into a crime, they were the words of someone who planned it, step by step, in chilling detail. And yet, as damning as the evidence appeared, something was missing. Robinson refused to speak. During questioning, his responses were empty, evasive, or non-existent. In the courtroom he sat quietly, offering nothing to explain the reasons behind his actions. His silence became its own force, a void that left investigators frustrated, families heartbroken, and the public grasping for answers. The silence was powerful. It gave Robinson control, even behind bars. The evidence showed what he had done. But without his words, the most crucial question remained unanswered. Why Charlie Kirk? Why then? Why at all? As prosecutors prepared their case, they leaned on the trail Robinson had already left behind, the DNA, the messages, the preparations. But still, there was a gap they couldn't fill. They could prove the crime, they could prove the planning, but they couldn't yet prove the motive. It was in that gap, in that silence, that the mystery of Tyler Robinson deepened. The investigation had revealed the how, it had revealed the when, but the why, the most haunting piece of all, remained locked away, waiting to be uncovered. From the moment of his arrest, Tyler Robinson said nothing. Question after question was met with silence. In the courtroom, his presence was cold, almost detached. He gave investigators nothing, no insight, no emotion, no explanation. For families mourning Charlie Kirk, that silence felt unbearable. For prosecutors, it was infuriating. For the public, it became one of the most unsettling features of the case. But then, everything changed. After months of speculation, after endless silence, Robinson finally broke. In a confession no one saw coming, he spoke. For the first time since his arrest, Robinson gave an account of what happened, and more importantly, why. He admitted to the act, but his words carried a startling twist. He claimed he wasn't entirely self-directed. According to Robinson, someone had influenced him. Someone had encouraged the act. Someone had sent him. It wasn't described as a simple command. Robinson suggested it was influence, pressure, and persuasion that built over time until the decision no longer felt like his alone. He painted himself not as a mastermind, but as a man pushed forward by forces bigger than himself. The confession shifted everything. Suddenly this was no longer just the story of one man's violent act. It was the story of possible manipulation, of hidden influence, of a darker presence operating behind the scenes. But as Robinson spoke, contradictions emerged. On one hand, he described himself as vulnerable, as a follower led astray. On the other, investigators had already uncovered messages that showed careful planning, discussions about timing, about concealing evidence, about carrying out the act in detail. Prosecutors seized on those contradictions. To them, Robinson's confession was not a revelation revelation, it was an
I think it's
excuse.
worth
They
to
argued
have
he
a
was
cost
deflecting responsibility,
unfortunately, some
shaping
gun
a
deaths
story
every
that
single
might
year,
soften
so
the
that
weight
we
of
can
his
have
guilt.
the Second
Investigators
Amendment to
treated the
protect
claims
our other
cautiously.
God-given
Was there
rights.
truly
That
someone
is a
else involved?
prudent
Or
deal.
was Robinson using the idea of influence to complicate the narrative and shift blame away from himself? His defense team, however, leaned heavily into his words. They argued that Robinson's state of mind was not entirely his own. They painted him as a man manipulated, pressured, even coerced, his vulnerabilities exploited by someone who knew exactly how to push him toward a destructive path. This tension created a new kind of trial. Before the trial itself, was Robinson telling the truth about hidden influence, or was this just another layer of deception? The confession had cracked the silence wide open. But instead of clarity, it left behind even more questions. Was Tyler Robinson a willing planner who carried out his own dark intentions? Or was he a pawn, a man manipulated into violence by forces we have yet to uncover? When Tyler Robinson finally entered the courtroom for trial, the weight of his confession hung over everything. The prosecution came prepared with evidence, digital trails, hidden clothing, DNA traces, and the rifle itself. To them, this was an open and shut case of premeditated murder. They showed the jury Discord messages in which Robinson laid out fragments of his plan. They revealed text messages to his roommate, where he admitted stashing clothing and concealing weapons. They argued these were not the actions of a man under control, but the calculated steps of someone who knew exactly what he intended to do. The defense countered with Robinson's own words. They framed him as a man influenced, pressured, and manipulated. They leaned into the confession, painting Robinson not as a cold planner, but as a vulnerable follower. They argued his silence before the confession was not defiance, but fear of revealing how deeply someone else's hand had shaped his choices. Witnesses were called. Experts weighed in. Prosecutors hammered at contradictions in Robinson's story. Investigators admitted they had found no clear evidence of another figure directly commanding him. And yet the possibility of subtle influence, the idea of manipulation hung in the air, difficult to dismiss completely, impossible to prove beyond doubt. For the jury, the case became a question of responsibility. Was Robinson fully accountable for his actions, or was there enough truth in his claim of influence to shift the story? The verdict, when it came, was both expected and divisive. Tyler Robinson was found guilty on the most serious charges: aggravated murder, obstruction, and tampering with evidence. The court ruled that regardless of influence, his preparation and actions proved intent. The sentence was heavy, the maximum allowed under state law. But even as the gavel struck, the story felt unfinished. For Charlie Kirk's family, the verdict brought some relief, but not the closure they longed for. For the community, questions remained. And for those who listened carefully to Robinson's confession, one thought refused to fade. If he was telling the truth about being sent, then justice had not yet reached everyone responsible. The trial gave a verdict, but it did not give all the answers. Tyler Robinson's confession may have sealed his own fate, but it also opened a window into something larger, something unsettling about influence, manipulation, and the hidden pressures that can drive an individual toward violence. This case forces us to ask difficult questions. How vulnerable are individuals like Robinson to persuasion? In a digital world where communities form in the shadows of encrypted apps and anonymous forums, how easy is it for someone to plant an idea, nurture it, and watch as it grows into action? Prosecutors argued that Robinson alone bore responsibility, but his own words suggest a different narrative, that someone somewhere pushed him down a destructive path. Whether that influence came from a specific figure or from the echo chamber of online radicalization, the result was the same. Charlie Kirk's death was not just an isolated act of violence. It reflected a larger struggle society faces: the battle for the minds of young impressionable individuals who search for meaning in dangerous places. If Robinson was manipulated, then who or what was behind it? Was it an individual who saw him as a weapon to be used, or was it the broader influence of toxic communities that thrive on anger, division, and the promise of belonging? Even the courtroom couldn't answer that question, and perhaps it never will. But what remains undeniable is this: the story of Tyler Robinson and Charlie Kirk reveals just how fragile the line can be between belief and action, between influence and violence, between thought and tragedy. When one man's silence hides the truth, and when his confession only deepens the mystery, we are left confronting not just the crime itself, but the world that allowed it to happen. The story of Tyler Robinson and Charlie Kirk is
Organization.
not one that ends
Turning Point
neatly with a
USA.
verdict.
He was
It
fatally
lingers.
wounded
It
on
leaves
Wednesday,
behind
September
echoes of
10th during a
silence,
campus
fragments
event
of
in Utah Valley
confession, and
University
unanswered
in
questions
Orem,
about
Utah.
what truly lies
Authorities have
behind a
identified
violent act.
22-year-old
Was
Tyler
Robinson
Robinson
simply a
as
man who
suspect
chose
who
his
allegedly
path,
killed
carrying
Kirk.
out a plan
Here
he
is a
built on
timeline
his
of how
own,
the
or
shooting
was he, as he
unfolded and how
claims,
Robinson
upon
was
someone
arrested.
guided, influenced, and sent by forces that
According to
remain
Utah
hidden in the
Governor
shadows?
Spencer Cox,
We may never
suspect
fully
Tyler
know.
Robinson
The silence
arrived
has
at
been
UVU's
broken, but
campus
the
at
truth is still
8:29 a.m.
unclear.
local
What we
time
do
on the
know
day
is
of the
that a
shooting,
life was lost.
driving a gray
Charlie
Dodge
Kirk's voice
Challenger.
was silenced in an
Organization.
instant, his
Turning
absence
Point
felt not
USA.
only by
He
his
was
family
fatally
and
wounded on
friends,
Wednesday,
but by a
September
nation
10th
watching
during a
in
campus event
disbelief.
in Utah
And Tyler
Valley
Robinson,
University
whether
in
acting
Orem,
alone
Utah.
or under
Authorities have
influence, must
identified
now live with the
22-year-old
weight of his
Tyler
actions,
Robinson
and with
as
the
a
legacy
suspect
of
who
a
allegedly
crime that
killed Kirk.
continues to raise
Here is
more
a timeline
questions
of
than
how the shooting
answers. So we
unfolded
ask
and how
you, the
Robinson
viewer,
was
what do you
arrested.
believe? Was justice truly served?
According
Or
to
does
Utah Governor
Robinson's
Spencer
confession
Cox,
reveal a deeper
suspect
story
Tyler
still
Robinson
waiting to
arrived
come
at
to light?
UVU's campus
Share your
at
thoughts in the
8:29
comments,
a.m. local
and let
time
us know
on
where
the
in
day
the
of the
world
shooting,
you're watching from.
driving a
If
gray
you
Dodge
found this case
Challenger.
as haunting
Bo
as we
Mason,
did,
the
don't
commissioner
forget
for
to
the
like
Utah
this
Department
video,
of Public
subscribe
Safety,
to our
said
channel,
authorities
and hit
tracked
the
the suspect's
notification bell
movements
so you
onto the
never miss
campus.
our deep dives
the
into true crime
stairwells,
stories that
up to the
shape the
roof,
world we
across the
live in.
roof to a
Because
shooting
sometimes
location.
the story doesn't end with the crime, it begins with the questions that follow.
At
Until next
12:07
time,
p.m.,
stay
a crowd
safe,
awaits
stay
Charlie
aware,
Kirk at
and
UVU,
never stop
the
asking
first stop on
questions.
Turning Point USA's The American Comeback Tour.